Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and it's a pleasure to stand today to get a chance yet again to debate another block opposition day on securities regulation in Canada, a topic I very much enjoy debating. I believe this is either the fifth or sixth such opposition day that the bloc has introduced on the exact same subject. So we are hearing some of the same arguments, but it's always worth visiting these issues again. Madam Speaker, I would like to address, and members have referred to this, I would like to focus my comments on a particular aspect of this debate and focus especially on my home province of Alberta. However, before I do, I would like to briefly address two items. First of all, in my capacity as Chair of the Finance Committee, I would like to note for the benefit of the House that the Finance Committee has endorsed a national regulator on numerous occasions. Most recently in our pre-budget consultation tabled last December, where the committee again recommended the government should continue to move forward on a national securities regulator. Secondly, I would like to take to task, frankly, the bloc and other opponents of a national securities regulator for repeatedly attempting to suggest that both the IMF and the OECD believe Canada's security system is without flaw. This is clearly not supported by fact, and in the spirit of fair and reasoned debate among learned individuals, we should not allow this to continue. Both the IMF and the OECD have been crystal clear that the lack of a national regulator is a key and significant flaw in the Canadian financial system. The OECD has said, and I quote, "The current diversity of regulations, for example, each province having its own securities regulator, makes it difficult to maximize efficiency and increases the risk that firms will choose to issue securities in other countries. A single regulator would eliminate the inefficiencies created by the limited enforcement authority of individual provincial agencies." The IMF sounded a very similar warning when it said, and I quote, "A federal regulator could coordinate more readily with other regulators in monitoring risk and responding quickly to a crisis, and could also have an enhanced focus on the issues that security markets may pose for national financial stability." Neither statement is open to interpretation. Both the IMF and the OECD clearly support a national regulator. What's more, Madam Speaker, both of these organizations are not alone. Countless groups in Canada and beyond have joined their call. While the list is too long to mention, I will quote from a few and note a few. It includes everyone from victims groups like the Earl Jones Organizing Committee, unions like the National Union of Public and General Employees, financial service groups like the Canadian Bankers Association, nearly every major newspaper editorial board in the country, investor groups like the Canadian Foundation for Advancement of Investor Rights, retiree groups like the Canadian Association of Retired Teachers, pension plans like the Municipal Pension Board of Trustees, and the list goes on and on. However, as impressive as the list of supporters is, it unfortunately has not yet swayed opponents of a national regulator. And unfortunately, Madam Speaker, one of those opponents is the government of my home province of Alberta, which is what I want to focus on in the rest of my remarks. I emphasize and underline that the government of Alberta is in opposition, and I emphasize here not necessarily the people or the businesses of the province. In fact, even my friend Alberta Finance Minister Ted Morton was recently forced to concede that Albertans were not of one mind on this issue. I would further note that a recent Canada West Foundation survey of 300 economists and financial analysts in the 4 Western Canadian provinces found that nearly 70% support for a national securities regulator, including a solid majority, 68% support in Alberta. As Canada West Foundation policy analyst Dan Gibbons noted, from an economic perspective, it is still seen as a positive, even in Alberta. Moreover, many prominent Alberta leaders or public interest groups have spoken out in support of a national securities regulator, and I think I should recognize the efforts by Hal Quesley, who was obviously with TransCanada, who was with the Hawken report that did an awful lot of work in terms of producing the report that spurred on the government to act in this manner. But I would also like to point out other people. For instance, Heather Douglas, President and CEO of the Calgary Chamber of Commerce. She has strongly registered her support for the initiative, and I quote, "Our member companies continue to express a great deal of frustration with the multiple regulators' insufficient enforcement, lack of technical expertise, conflicting regulations, and high costs to raise money on Canada's multiple stock markets. The Chamber calls on the provincial government still opposed to a sole regulator to reconsider their stance. Our startup member companies need capital to take their innovative goods and services to the marketplace. Our profitable businesses will be choked if they continue to waste investor money complying with conflicting legislative demands, end quote. The Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada has also noted, and I quote again, the urgent need for a common securities regulator and for proportionate-based regulation. Giant-sized rules for junior companies create poor conditions for companies that help open up economic opportunities, particularly for communities in Canada's northern and more remote regions. And I'd like to quote another friend and someone who played an instrumental role in getting Alberta, frankly, back on a solid fiscal track, perhaps the person who did so more than any other, which was former Alberta Treasurer Jim Dinning, who wrote an excellent article recently on a national regulator. He recently declared, and I quote, "We need our financial regulators to better monitor these peril-creating events and act quickly to protect Canadians and their marketplace. But a system of 13 securities regulators can't keep up. It's almost built to frustrate effective action. We need a regulatory framework that can speed up reforms required by structural changes coming at us, largely from rapidly evolving technologies. The existing system is not designed to accommodate that, lacking both coordination and depth of expertise." I encourage members on both sides of the House to read the full article by Jim Dinning, the former Treasurer of Alberta. It's an excellent argument in favor of a national regulator. I'd like to also quote from newspaper editorials, like a recent Edmonton Journal editorial that stated, "We remain the only country in the developed world to lack a national regulator of financial markets. Let's get on with having a common regulator, like adults elsewhere." Or a Calgary Herald editorial that was quite forceful and stated, "A single regulator should lead to a smaller, simpler, less costly and more efficient system, making it easier and cheaper for companies to raise capital. Today, Canada is the only developed country in the world without a single regulator, much to our competitive disadvantage globally." The irony is that Alberta companies have long left that territorial mentality behind, like TransCanada. Alberta has no business being a holdout. However, while noting the many supporters of a national regulator in Alberta, I concede that, like Quebec, some have remained skeptical and opposed. I would further suggest that most of that opposition is based on fears that a national regulator will not recognize the unique characteristics of regional markets and a legitimate interest in promoting vibrant local markets. That is why I want to address some of these concerns, and I strongly suggest, and I will outline why, what is being proposed by our Conservative government actually dispels those fears by acknowledging the importance of regional input and by prompting strong local markets. Again, to quote former Alberta Treasurer Jim Dinning, "This is a national regulator that's being proposed, not a federal regulator. The DNA of provincial and regional markets must be integrated into the decision-making process right from the outset." First and foremost, our Conservative government, when developing the Securities Act, we did not do so unilaterally in Ottawa. This was not a made-in-Ottawa top-down exercise. We invited all willing provinces to the table. We set up a transition office, which was not headed by someone, as the Bloc will often point out, someone from Toronto. This was headed by the chair of the British Columbia Securities Commission. And in fact, I want to thank Douglas Hyman for all his excellent work to date. This is what he did, is he made an effort to work with the provinces, to get the federal government and the 10 provinces and territories to work collaboratively together on this initiative. And as one participating province, through the head of the Saskatchewan Financial Services Commission, recently confirmed, we've enjoyed some good dialogue with the Canadian Securities Transition Office on the development of this Act. Indeed, the proposed Canadian Securities Act goes to great effort to stress that. To start, it would not force any province or territory to participate in a Canadian securities regulator. It would be strictly voluntary. Provinces and territories would have the complete freedom to opt in or not. What's more, far from being an intrusion into provincial jurisdiction, it actually respects constitutional jurisdiction, regional interests, and local expertise. For instance, the proposed Act would establish a federal, provincial, territorial council of ministers consisting of the Minister of Finance and other members appointed by and representing each participating province and territory. The Council would have a statutory mandate to facilitate consultations and the exchange of information with respect to the administration of the Act and securities regulation policy in general. In addition, the Council of Ministers would advise on appointments of the Board Chair and members and other members of the Canadian Securities Tribunal.